26. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the voice
morning. Beautiful day. Beautiful faces here in this room. So happy you're here. Isaiah Part 2. We're looking at the second half of Isaiah for our summer quarter series. Of course, back in the winter we studied the first half of Isaiah. Now we are looking at the second half. Our lesson today is the servant of the Lord, as I mentioned last Sunday before we were dismissed. The servant of the Lord, and we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 20. If you want to turn your Bibles there, help you follow along better, to glean more and a deeper understanding of God's message for us today. Isaiah 42, the servant of the Lord. I did some math, and that may be scary for some of you, but I counted 20 times in Isaiah chapters 40 through 53, the second half of Isaiah, the phrase, the servant of the Lord, appears. That's a phrase that is common in the book of Isaiah. The identity of the servant, though, varies. Sometimes he is the entire nation of Israel. Other times he is a pagan king like Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus. Sometimes the servant appears as a people. Sometimes as an individual. Sometimes the servant speaks to God. Other times he is addressed by God. Sometimes he vicariously suffers for the people of God. He suffers because he is God's servant. But he always does what the will of God is. So the unifying theme of what is known as the servant songs, and that's what we're in the section of here in Isaiah. The servant songs, and the unifying theme is that the servant acts in the affairs of men to bring about God's will. So, always doing God's will. The servant is front and center in the sections of the prophet that we've come to know and label as what's known as the servant songs. Like I said, beginning here at chapter 2 of Isaiah and going through chapter 53. Now, mind you, Isaiah does not categorically designate these and label them the servant songs. That's something that readers of the Bible over the centuries have labeled them. Scholars differ in identifying them, but the servant songs is one common way we would say to categorize them or group them. So from the first of the songs, that's beginning here in chapter 42, and going forward, it is clear that the servant songs are not meant by Isaiah to be a self-description. What I mean is God speaks to his servant in the third person, but the servant's responsibility is not the same as the prophet Isaiah. The servant, in other words, is not the author of the book of Isaiah, nor any part of it. So in them, the servant is revealed. He is majestic in his being and bearing. God upholds the servant. He chooses him, and he puts his spirit upon him. And it's through him God promises to bring justice to the Gentiles. So the servant is more than Isaiah. Yet Isaiah too, not only is he a prophet, but Isaiah is also a servant as well. But in some sense, the servant stands, he represents the remnant of the people of God. That's one sense. But in another sense, he suffers so that the remnant may find peace and redemption through his resurrection, through his intercession. The contrasts in this section are common. The nations worship idols who do nothing because, as we've been talking about, they are nothing. Okay? The servant, though, of the Lord is something. He acts. So he has no form or comeliness. His divinity is announced in more subtle ways. He establishes justice for Israel and places all peoples whom God created in equal need. But in short, and in summary, before we read our text, the servant of the Lord is a creative nobody in the book of Isaiah. For the way that God's people, sometimes individually, yes, sometimes collectively, are to respond to him. The servant is loving, and he is forgiving. He extends his grace because grace and goodness partake of his being. And probably of greatest importance, the servant is the creative might of God who has brought the universe into existence. You go over into the New Testament book of Matthew, found in the words of Isaiah 42 is a description of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is what Matthew wrote by inspiration. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. That's Matthew 12 and verse 18. So that'll bring us to our first section. We need to read the first 7 verses of Isaiah 42. The Creator delights in his servants. So I would like to call on several readers this morning. Just ask that you read loudly and slowly and clearly, please, so everybody can hear and read and keep up. Whoever wants to start us off.
Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my elect one is whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles.
He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. Verse 3, he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench. He will bring forth justice for truth.
He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice on the earth, and the coastland will wait expectantly for his law.
Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. And I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, to open blind eyes, to bring up prisoners from the dungeon, and those who dwell in darkness from the prison.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. So we know what a prophet is or does or did. They are a spokesperson for God, right? So the prophet is the mouthpiece of God to the nation of Israel. As God speaks through Isaiah here in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 42, the words don't fit well with chapter 41, the previous chapter, verses 25 through 29, and also verses 5 through 9 here in 42. They fit kind of poorly. And I say that because the first of the servant songs stands alone. The words hardly have a context. Don't really have a context, but the servant is, here in this case, he is singular. Okay, he cannot really be equated with the people that God is leading from Babylon to Judah. But in chapter 41, the previous chapter, verse 8, notice the servant of God is Israel. Okay, that's obvious. But in chapter 42, in these first 4 verses we've read, the nation brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, the same God, the same nation God now leads back to Judah, has somehow, we might say, more or less faded into the background. But as Isaiah unfolds the song of the servant, and we call these the servant songs, as I mentioned, but the song of the servant, he uses the word justice 3 times. And you notice in verses 1, 3, and 4, notice what they are. Verse 1, notice the word justice. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles. Verse 3, he will bring forth justice for truth. Verse 4, he has established justice in the earth. So it might not be a bad idea if you wanted to, if you like to write in the Bible, just highlight that word justice, circle it, or underline it, however you like to do that. But 3 times, the song of the servant uses the word justice. So the traits or characteristics of God have become traits or characteristics of the servant. That the servant is elect, that God places his spirit upon him, as we've read, that the servant attends to the needs of God's people. A bruised reed he will not break, that he is never discouraging and is never discouraged. All of it has to do with the justice conveyed by God through the servant to the peoples of the earth. So in turn, God's justice is grounded and rooted in his law. So the land itself, in this context, was waiting for the time when the people who understood God's law would be brought back. Okay? So God's people would read the law, they would practice its precepts in the coastlands, as we've read here in this context. You know, for years the people of Judah had suffered on the banks of Babylon's canals, but the servant is the, if you will, the agent of God to bring them back to their homeland, to the hills of Judah, where priests, of course the priests being offspring of Aaron, they serve in the temple devoted to God the Creator. So contrast with the idols of Babylon is never far in the background, okay? The God who is leading Israel back to Judah is the Creator. Notice verse 5 again, please. Who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it. Who gives breath to the people on it. and spirit to those who walk on it. So that's a word. We say that word righteousness. That's a kind of a prevalent word for the God of Israel. God says in verse 6, again notice, I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles. The servant of the Lord would introduce the way for the Gentiles, the nations, to partake of the grace of the Creator. So the justice offered by the Christ is much more than the proper outcome of a trial of law. So it's through God's servant, justice was to spread throughout all the land. Distinctions based on ethnic origins would go away. They would disappear. Jew and Gentile, bond and free, male and female, that wouldn't mean anything. It would mean nothing. So with open arms, God embraces all within his just ways. So the person of the Christ would encourage understanding, love, and agreement among the races of the earth. A new song from the Lord, verses 8 through 13 now. Some more readers, please.
I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth. Ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof.
Let the wilderness and its cities lift up their voices. The settlements where Kedar inhabitants or inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing aloud. Let them shout for joy from the tops of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and declare his praise from the coastlands. The Lord will go forth like a warrior. He will arouse his zeal like a man of war. He will utter a shout. Yes, he will raise a war cry. He will prevail against his enemies.
Thank you all very much. This goes without saying, but the God of the people of Israel was in a class altogether different from the idols served by the nations. God would not share his glory with the gods of other peoples. His name was Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Israel. No God was like him. Israel knew the Lord was different from the gods of the nations because he alone knew the affairs and how the affairs of men would unfold, because God declared new things. In verse 9, before they spring forth, God said, I will tell you of them. So the God leading Israel to Judah knew the future as well as the past. He spoke to his people from the overflow of knowledge encompassing all the affairs of men. The gods of the nations, of course, we've talked about and discussed, they were nothing more than the creations of men. They said nothing. They did nothing because they were nothing. They knew nothing. But the God who led Israel to Canaan differed greatly from the gods of Babylon. Isaiah is caught up in the praise here. Isaiah, as he says, sang a new song because God was doing a new thing. So, as Amy read this section for us, from the coastlands to the villages of Kedar, people would know of the work of Yahweh. All would lift up their voices in praise. But the glory was to the Lord, and it was not to any natural occurrences. And as he led Israel, Yahweh would be like, as it says here in the description, he would be like a mighty man of war. So he would shout out, and all his enemies would flee away in shame. Number 3, the third and last section, leader of the deaf and the blind, verses 14 to 20. Can we get some readers, please?
I have held my peace a long time. I have been still and restrained myself. Now I will cry like a woman in labor. I will faint and gasp at once. I will lay waste the mountains and hills, and dry up all their vegetation. I will make their rivers coastlands, and I will dry up the pools.
And I will bring the blind by way that they knew not,
Thank you all very much. And I mentioned this a moment ago. Sometimes in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, God speaks to Israel in the first person. For a long time, throughout the 70 years of Jeremiah, God had been still. Okay, here's the contrast. Through the 70 years of Jeremiah, the prophet, God had not acted. He had been silent or still. He had restrained himself, is the word used here. So the time had come for him now to be loud. Okay? So for him to shout out like a woman, as the description is, like a woman giving birth to a child. So as he marched before Israel, he laid waste the mountains. God put them in place. So God now took away obstacles as Israel found its way back to Canaan. He dried up the rivers so that they became the coastlands. The pools of water became waste. In short, the Lord did as he pleased. So he created the earth. And as the Redeemer of the people, he laid it bare when it pleased him. The King James Version of 1611 had God destroying and devouring. If you're reading from that translation, you may notice that. The New King James Better is a better translation when it has God here in labor, like a woman giving birth, his panting and gasping. It's a better description. So God brings the faithful back to Judah. They are the blind, those who do not know the way. So as the terms like poor and needy, in some of the Psalms, they come to mean the humble. For an example, you'll look at Psalm 34 and verse 6, Psalm 40, verse 17. The blind and deaf in Isaiah 42 and verse 16 here, and verse 18 are those who confess their need for God's help. So during his call, God pointed out to Isaiah that some were blind and deaf basically because they wanted it that way. Okay? God's word came to the prophet Isaiah, but the people of God refused to hear him. I think Kim read that for us there in verse 9. So, but the blind and the deaf, they also may be those who recognize and confess their dependence in God. You know, they are humble in spirit. The blind and deaf in Isaiah 42 are those who confess that God made the eye and the ear. God causes adversity or goodness to come upon his people. And some of the Jews readily, we know, they readily adopted the gods of foreigners. In verse 17, I like this verse, they shall be turned back, they shall be greatly ashamed. Who trust in carved images? Who say to the molded images, you are our gods? The servant of the Lord, his messenger, willingly lives with his blindness in his deafness, depending upon the Lord to guide him in the way of holiness. But let me say, from chapter 40, as Isaiah speaks from chapter 40 onward, the Lord guides his people through the barren land of the Euphrates River so that they might come home. So remember and keep this in mind, the generation coming back to Canaan is not the old generation, okay? The one who saw the siege of Jerusalem, the one who witnessed that, those terrible events, the one who experienced the bloodshed and death brought on by the armies of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Not the same generation. Psalm 137 tells us that the Babylonian king swept the city, he killed the helpless. And only a few of the old ones remember the glories of Jerusalem and the temple before they fell. So the prophet Isaiah reminds the people that they had no gods. You know, the Lord, God of Israel, you know, he had not forgotten his people. We know that the word Jew comes from the word Judah, you know, and only so, you know, that southern kingdom, and only a remnant of the southern kingdom survived. It was the nation over which the seed of David had ruled, the part or section of the kingdom through whom the Christ was to come into the world. So Isaiah makes it abundantly clear that the Creator was Yahweh, the God of Israel. He was fundamentally different from the so-called gods of Babylon. He carried his people, and he was not carried by them. Is there any discussion, thoughts, comments, anything on our lesson this morning or our text here in Isaiah 42? On page 20, if you have a copy of the Foundations book, we have some discussion questions. But does anybody have anything you'd like to share with the class? I'll open it up for you to do so. Number one, how did Jesus' ministry mirror the description of the Lord's servant? You know, I talked a little bit about that, but What say you? I want to hear from you. How did Jesus' ministry mirror the description of the Lord's servant here in Isaiah 42?
Well, both were trying to seek and save the lost, and trying to get people to turn away from idols and turn away from the evil ways and follow them.
Okay, that's good. Anything else?
They both carry out God's plan.
Absolutely, yeah.
Jesus went to the cross, died for us, that was part of God's whole deal from the beginning.
Yeah. Both, we could say both were obedient to God and done and carried out His will.
Carried
Yeah,
out the prophecy, basically.
absolutely. Okay, good. That's good, Amy. Anything else?
Brought forth justice to all nations, so it's for the Gentiles and the Jews.
Yes. To all nations, not just Judah or the nation of Israel, but to all nations, which includes the Gentiles. Good, John. Anything else?
If you think about when the Jews kind of demanded God, so to speak, in my opinion, and think God's plan was to bring the Gentiles in all along, because they were kind of, Gentiles were more faithful to God, just like what the Jews turned out to be, in a way, I guess. I don't know.
In some sense, yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, yeah. Yeah. Okay? Anything else on number 1? Number 2, ask what can we learn about God from this passage? Obviously, we've discussed some of it here in the last few minutes, but is there something we might add to this?
Patient, long-suffering.
Patience, long-suffering. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, sure.
He cares about us.
Obviously, yeah. John says He cares about us. Is there anything we could add to that? God's working out His plan. And even though He doesn't speak directly to man today, He's working, if you want to call it behind the scenes, through His providence, still carrying out His will, right? His will is being done. Okay? You might not always recognize it, but God is still on His throne and He still works in the affairs of men. Not, again, mind you, in a miraculous way, but does anybody have anything you'd like to add to this? Any questions, comments? Number 3, how do we demonstrate our willingness to trust God?
I did what He said in His word.
I think that's certainly an important one, the big one, we might say. Just do what He says in His Word, right? Is there another way to demonstrate our willingness to trust God?
Don't trust in idols or molten images.
Why? Because they're nothing, right? Yeah. Crafted by the hand of men. But God is the creator of the universe who's literally spoke the world into existence. That's a good one, John, yeah. Anything?
Today, we should be careful not to worship
To worship what, man?
the false teachers.
With false teachers? Yeah. Okay, good. Absolutely. Certainly. Yeah. Sheila said there's a lot out there, unfortunately, false teachers, so that's certainly correct.
A person that didn't know the Bible, they could really be easily misled.
Okay. Well, sure. Sure.
Other people said that.
Yeah. Okay.
That's why we need to know what the Bible says ourselves, not take somebody's word.
Okay. Very good. How do we demonstrate our willingness? The question is, how do we demonstrate our willingness to trust God? Had a few answers on that. They're good answers. Sure.
And like I said, as Helen said too, Bible study is very important as well too, knowing what His will is for us. And also giving back to Him in prayer and thankfulness for things He's provided to us. Like when I see the blind and deaf, I always think of the priests in the time of Christ that they'd been practicing the customs of their fathers for centuries and been told that this man was coming, this king was coming, and what their expectations were. They wanted this physical kingdom, and they had no comprehension of the spiritual kingdom to come. They kept waiting for another David or another something like that.
Yeah.
And they weren't going to get that. But in willingness, I guess basically us giving back to Him through our spiritual, our faith back to Him.
Okay. I like that, Amy. That's good too. Did somebody over here start to say something else along with this? I'm sorry. Miss Whitman, did you have something else that you wanted to add? Okay. Well, we're going to stop there then. If nobody has anything, let's. I know sometimes the tendency may be, especially in the Old Testament and Isaiah, you know, we might get bogged down with a lot of the information and things, and it might, I'm hesitant to use the word, become lackluster in our study, but Isaiah is, 60, got all those chapters, and it's certainly a lot to be learned, but I know you can kind of get bogged down with all that information and have a tendency just to kind of skim over it when you're reading, but very powerful lessons to learn from the book of the prophet. So we'll look at lesson 3, Lord willing, 1 week from today. You are precious. With that, we go to the next chapter, chapter 43, if you want to read over that and read your lesson here in your foundations book. But thank you for your comments, those of you who read, and especially for your kind attention this morning.
morning. I know everybody's probably looking at the clock and going, what's he doing up there before quarter till? I'll go ahead and say as part of our announcements, the men need to have a quick business meeting after services this morning, something that Brother Chris needs to discuss with us, kind of urgent, couldn't be put off. So I'm going to go ahead and start the announcements early this morning, try to buy us a few minutes for that. There's a gospel meeting going to be at Montrose Church of Christ in Carthage, Tennessee, June the 19th through the 23rd.